Do you think that because the American pop psychology is like, oh, be yourself, be authentic, find your enjoyment, integrate into the social order. Like, if you're having trouble, if you're maladaptive, if you're not integrating, then you need therapy, and then we can integrate you back in somehow. And in part of what it might be doing, it might have. Do you think it might have inherited that early Freud a little bit, where it's just kind of like, yeah, people want their own happiness. They want a pleasurable life. So the goal is to get them there, and we'll get down to their authentic self, and then they'll be able to do it.
So I'm so glad you said that. I meant to bring this up earlier, but you remember in the Jordan Peterson Zizek debate, there was one thing that they both agreed on, and it's that happiness is bullshit as the end all be all to life. And Peterson is a Jungian, Zizek is a Lacanian, but I have to wonder if the secret the agreement is actually based on their understanding of death drive. Because if happiness, as we fantasize about the idea of being happy, it's really a life without any tension, right? Of perfect prolonged satisfaction. And the Freudian psychoanalytic insight would be, well, that ain't happening. Death drive is here to stay. Remember, Lacan said it's ontological. And now even Freud suggests that it's even primary. So the idea of human beings reaching some sort of blissful state of perfect balance and tensionlessness is completely mythological from the perspective of psychoanalysis. And despite their many differences, I kind of think that's why both Peterson and Zizek reject the concept of happiness.
Totally.
Because here's the thing, really, if you're happy, it's just a stroke of luck. It's not something you can actually work towards. It's something you really don't have control over. There are times in your life that, based on the certain situation, you could say, yeah, I'm actually happy at this point in my life. But it's beyond your control, and it's a matter of chance and luck. And the idea that we're all just supposed to work towards happiness, like it's something that we can just reach and then perpetually sustain, that is absurd from the perspective of death drive. Our very libidinal economies are based on undermining our pleasure. And here's the thing, right? In our example earlier, even if you have prolonged pleasure, that's not good enough to you. Like I said, you could be in a relationship and it can be on paper a good relationship. You have trust, you have reliability, you have a strong bond, and yet not good enough. That pleasure, that happiness isn't enough. Mm-hmm. And so it's like you have to, that's part of our tragedy of being the kind of beings that we are. And so I agree with, I hate to agree with Peterson on anything, but I do. I agree with him and Zizek that I don't think happiness is the right goal for human beings. Right. I think freedom or equality or solidarity, I think these are much more important, better aims for society, because I think those involve actual structural dynamics that we could potentially accomplish, whereas happiness is, again, it's so chance based that it's really not a good aim.
Right. Well, and the idea that the U.S. is supposedly founded on the right to the pursuit of happiness, right? It's like, which was originally going to be written as property, the right of property, and like so the idea of like that these two words were interchangeable for them, right? The right to property is how John Locke wrote about it. Yeah, exactly. But like that was like that is classical liberal ideology to its like core, is the idea that you as an individual can reach your own happiness in the pursuit of property through the game of one-upmanship in an economy. And
it's pure ideology. I mean, that's the thing, right? If we take Zizek's concept of ideology, or at least how he formulates it at one point, ideology is that which conceals or covers over a deadlock or an impossibility, right? And really, I mean, psychoanalysis would say being happy is an impossibility at the very ontological level. And yet, that's what ideology is always trying to sell us. So to sell us the idea of happiness is really to convince us that we can become a being that we aren't, like we can have a whole different ontology, right? And which of course is impossible. So the ideology of happiness is very much a rejection of our fundamental ontology. And I mean, of course, like, obviously there's better situations to live in, right? And some people would reject what we're saying here because they would have a different concept of happiness. Fair enough, right? Some people will have a much more realistic concept of happiness, and that's fine. But the way the concept of happiness generally works, and the way especially consumer society sells it to us, is that if we work hard, we will eventually reach this state of like perfect, prolonged satisfaction, where it's like we've bought the last commodity we need, and like, oh, now I've got everything I want. And the idea of happiness being actual perfect satisfaction in having everything you want. You realize like that would be the end of desire. We are desiring subjects. Desire is this, I mean, without desire, we're not even human being anymore. So happiness is really this image of us not being human beings.
Exactly. Yeah, this is where Fight Club comes in, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah.
You've got all the things. You've got all the stuff. It's all in order. You're not just successful, but you're like living a life of pleasure, and you've achieved it.
The narrator, Edward Norton, has everything that society says he needs to have a good life, and he does. He has job security. He has a good paycheck. He has a great apartment. He's filled it with what Baudrillard calls the system of objects, which is all of the consumer goods that are idiosyncratic that you use to give yourself a sense of individuality, right? He's got the whole thing, and yet he's miserable. And who is Tyler? What's he say to him when they're, the narrator's on the bus with Tyler, and he looks at the ad of, I think it's Calvin Klein, of the male model. And he looks at Tyler and he goes, "Is that what a man looks like?" And Tyler says, "Self-improvement is masturbation," right? Like, the idea of self-improving to the way that society tells you to is bullshit. But what does he say? Now, self-destruction, right? So Tyler really embodies death drive, right? The whole thing is he's trying to blow apart the narrator's consumer identity, his position in this world. And this is what we mean, Lacanians mean by symbolic death, right? You want to die away from your social position, right? Again, we've talked about it before when we talk Heidegger, where if you are a piano player and that's been your project your whole life, and you're in a horrible accident and you tragically lose your hands, right? Your whole world, it's not just the tragedy of this horrible thing happening to your body. Of course there's that, but it's also the fact that you can't be the person you once were within your world. And so it's not just that you lose parts of your body, you lose your very self. And that, in that situation, is absolutely a tragedy. But there's times where your symbolic position, who you are in your world, is precisely the tragedy. And death drives what can help us break out of these allotted positions, these allotted identities in society. And so this is where death drive actually takes on a very positive revolutionary force, because it frees us from our social facticity, from the social basic coordinates we're thrown into in our little world. And so in a weird sense, we'll see it's actually the motor of freedom. And so this is why I said early on, we don't want to think death drive as bad and pleasure as good. They both can be bad and good, depending on the scenario.
And right, death drive can be liberating. Yeah. Absolutely.
And pleasure can be imprisoning. Again, think about it, like somebody who's in a relationship, and you go down all the lists of what usually define the good, healthy criteria of a relationship. And if you can mark yes to all of them, you can say, oh, see, I'm living in happiness. I'm living in pleasure. I've got a good relationship. And yet still that pleasure, it feels like a prison you want out of. And so again, it just depends on the those specific.
So are we just cursed then to constantly self-undermine any good situation we do find ourselves in? Is that a conclusion?
I mean, that's part of it. And so part of what we'll see is that we often fight our death drive, and obviously for, there's good reasons sometimes, but we act like it's not a part of us, or it's something we can get away from. And part of psychoanalysis, of course, it wants to help alleviate some of the problems generated by death drive, but it also wants us to learn to kind of, I mean, we can't really identify with it, but we can face up to the fact that this impulse is part of us, and it's just, there's no getting rid of it. And once you become aware, I mean, at first, when you start thinking in terms of death drive, it's most easy to see it at work in the people you're close with, right? Your family, your friends. Once you start to get an idea of how this thing works, you'll start to see it at work in everybody's lives around you. I see it in everybody. But it's like you as a psyche, right? This thing is positioned in your blind spot, right? McGowan emphasizes this, and they all emphasize this unconscious aspect of death drive. It's not like you're in control of it. It's in control of you, and there's
I'm so glad you said that. I'm so fucking glad you said that, because I just feel like it's like so much of the time when you're watching media critique or ideology critique, kind of stuff kind of in that vein, people think that everything's happening at this conscious, explicit level, as though that's yeah. Well, at least, and the thing is like, maybe we don't always know, but for sure, like, we should be less certain. That's the big thing. Is I just like the lack of epistemological humility, like, sometimes, because it's like, well, I think the natural conclusion of everything we're talking about is that, like, it should be a little less transparently obvious that we can be so certain of why we do the things that we do, like that. And that uncertainty, I think, is, I wouldn't say it's liberating, but it's important to get that kind of critical distance from not just yourself, but how you perceive reading intent into other people and stuff like that, which is why this is, this is useful, I think, for kind of a structuralist approach.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Which is why Zizek says the only way that you can be a Marxist anymore is if you're a Lacanian.
Yeah. And this is why I think it's so important. And I mean, we could even touch on this briefly because I think it's so good. Actually, here, let me grab the quote. It's what we were reading the other day. And so McGowan has this awesome book called The End of Dissatisfaction, Jacques Lacan and the Emerging Society of Enjoyment. And this is why Zizek says this. Says that about, if you're going to be a Marxist today, you got to go through Lacan. There's various different reasons why he says it, but I think McGowan really gets at something important, and it very much what Zizek has in mind here too, which is on page 4 of this book, McGowan says, though Marxism has certainly fallen on hard times today, this fundamental thesis of Marxism hasn't. Okay, well, we need context. But he comes down later and he says, but if Marx errs, his error does not lie, as his critics often allege, in underestimating innate human selfishness, right? That's the whole capitalist. I mean, capitalists are always going, oh, Marx is dumb because he thinks, like, people can be all non-selfish, and he doesn't understand that humans are intrinsically selfish and egotistic, and that's why communism can never work, right? We've all heard that a million times. But this is like the psychoanalytic response to Marx. Again, I'll read it again. But Marx errs. His error does not lie, as his critics often allege, in underestimating innate human selfishness. Instead, his error, and again, it is the common error today, lies in the other direction, in underestimating the capacity of subjects to act against their self-interest. Right? The idea with Marx is, there's these bad ideas that have been implanted in workers' minds, and he called it ideology or false consciousness. And if we just explain how capital works and show workers how they're being exploited, how they're being fucked over, then they will see that overthrowing the system is what is in all of their self-interest, and we'll have the proletarian revolution. And the problem is Marx is thinking only in terms of pleasure, right? He doesn't have this idea of, well, the big problem is that workers might very well enjoy their exploitation. That's what's difficult for all of us leftists to deal with. But that's why Zizek thinks understanding libidinal economy is essential for the left, because we always think that, like, oh, if we just show, if we can break the simulation in Baudrillard's terms, or we can show them like what's going on behind bullshit ideological mystifications, if we can get them to the truth, then they'll all act in their self-interest. And the point is, people don't act in their self-interest by and large. I mean, right. And that's death drive, right? And so this impulse to act against your self-interest is explained by psychoanalysis, and for Zizek, Lacan does it better than anybody. And so that's why he thinks libidinal economy is essential to understanding political economy, right? Because the idea is people are doing certain behaviors on a daily basis, and we call this the economy. And it's not just a matter of self-interest that's at play, it's how they're constantly undermining themselves. And so to understand how the economy works, we have to understand how libido, or jouissance, death drive, works too. And so that's why Zizek has spent so much of his career talking about how, you know, his famous his second book that he put out. It's called For They Know Not What They Do: Enjoyment as a Political Factor. Right? It's jouissance as a political factor.
I did not know about this book.
Yeah, so a lot of people actually think it's better than Sublime Object because it's actually more theoretical, and it was a series of lectures he gave to, I think, post-grad students or something, so he didn't feel like he had to dumb it down at all. It's more difficult, I think, than Sublime Object, but anyway, here's the thing. That subtitle could have been the same subtitle, you know, it could have been the subtitle for Sublime Object of Ideology, enjoyment as a political factor. And so his point is
I'm waving around a copy here, and by the way, everybody, it is signed. It is signed by Slavoj Žižek. Yeah. And anyway. So that's the idea, is that for us to understand how politics works, how the economy works, we have to understand how libidinal economy works, because they're intertwined. And yeah. So cool.
I guess the only quote I want to read from Freud before we move on to Lacan is this is from, and this is just so relevant, right? This is how he ends Civilization and its Discontents. He says, "The fateful question for the human species seems to me to be whether and to what extent their cultural development will succeed in mastering the disturbance of their communal life by the human instinct drive of aggression and self-destruction. It may be that in this respect, precisely the present time deserves a special interest." He's talking about this drive we have, and for him, he's thinking about it in terms of aggression and self-destruction. He's saying this in light of, you know, the development of nuclear weapons. Remember, this is in 1929. And so we're headed into that World War II period. And he's getting very nervous because he's seeing all of the technological machinations of humankind, and he's getting really worried because he's seeing, you know, technology keeps developing. Humanity could actually bring about its own extinction, and with climate change and everything, it's even more relevant now. And it sounds crazy at first, but you start going, do we enjoy our destruction of the planet? Are we actually libidinally invested in it? And somehow that's a very frightening thought, because again, like McGowans says, right, The Marxist idea is you point out to people what's in their self-interest, they register what's in their self-interest, and then they begin to act in their self-interest. But think of how many people have tried to explain to climate deniers the facts, the situation, and they just totally reject it. And it gets to a point where you go, something else is going on here, because they're not, it's easy to just call them stupid, but it's not a matter of intelligence. Something else is involved here. And it's oftentimes jouissance, it's enjoyment. They enjoy transgressing the law, going against the norms. They enjoy not being part of the system. Like, that's what's so troubling, is that oftentimes we think that these political positions, these political identities are rooted solely in misunderstandings. Like, oh, if we could just reach them, if we could just get them to see what's really going on. No, what you realize is that so much of ideology doesn't have to do with meaning or concepts or facts or anything like that. It has to do with how people get off on it's how people enjoy themselves. And so once you realize that, it's like Zizek's point is, you have to start taking a different approach in how you try to mobilize people, because if you point out self-interest, right, here is what is rational, here is what is good, here is what is lawful, here's what is in your self-interest, there's a part of people that are going to want to go against that just because, right? Because going against the law, going against what's good for us means enjoyment. That's how the unconscious thinks, right? That's the logic of the unconscious. And again, if we could mobilize the left into a unified force in the world, like by pointing out self-interest to people, then we would have done that a long time ago. We as leftists of all kinds realize, like, why is this so fucking hard to just get people to do what's good for them?
Yeah.
And this is what Zizek has one of his great insights, and what I think he has to teach us, being on the left, is, yeah, there is this other thing going on. And I think anybody who's been, an activist or an organizer knows all too well that this shit is happening.
Yeah, like the one joke that you use, that Zizek uses, right?
About the genie.
The genie, yeah. You
So
can do that.
the joke goes like this. Imagine there's a guy, and he's walking along minding his business, and then all of a sudden a magical genie appears to him and says, "Hey, I'm a magical genie, and I am here to grant you whatever your heart desires. You get one wish. And here's the catch, though. Whatever you choose for yourself, whatever you wish, I'm going to do that double to your neighbor." And so the guy sits there for a minute, and he contemplates, and he thinks real hard about what he wants and what his wish is, and he's thinking about his neighbor getting it twice as much as him. And after a long, good thought, he looks at the genie and goes, "Take one of my eyes." And so this is a psychoanalytic joke that goes to show that oftentimes people are very willing to sacrifice their enjoyment,
Right.
if it means even less enjoyment for somebody else.
Yeah.
Right? And this is the thing, like, there's a weird sense where you could say a lot of Trump supporters, for example, it's easy to go, oh, they're just misled, they're misconceived. But in reality, the psychoanalytic response would be, no, they elected Trump because they knew very well that it could mean worse situation for them, but they also think that it means twice as bad situation for liberals.
Exactly. Yeah. Relatable. Yeah.
Exactly. And so that's where you start to get that so many acts or political events, right? So many of the happenings in politics really have to do with these unconscious libidinal speculations, right? Like, people aren't even aware they're really thinking like that, because that's the whole point. There's a logic of consciousness. There's how we, and for the most part at the conscious level, of course, pleasure, self-interest, all of that kind of stuff is the main stuff. Most of us would not at the conscious level say, I'm trying to make my life worse. Like,
Well, and this is probably this is probably also why, you know, it's impossible to find consensus in a group of people, period. But especially when there's like a bipartisan or nonpartisan issue that's just like clearly for the general good. And, you know, well, I mean, obviously there's powered interests and such, but you know, to be able to show, hey, we could work together sometimes would probably actually, you know, it could also make you look good, right? But oh no, like the thing is your constituency wants to see the other side suffer. We're gonna make them sit in their skin and suffer. We want to make them sweat. You want to fucking, oh, like we could actually all come to accord on something and actually do something? No. We got to make them sweat. Yeah. Which is why for me, I mean, just like, you know, I try like, yeah, it's a rough relationship with me and just like culture war in general. Cause it's like, it's so easy to get sucked into, but at the same time, it's like, oh my fucking God. Like, can we fucking actually see some material changes like immediately? Because we're about to go off a cliff here.
Well, you know? And here's the thing, like I said, I want to get to these points at the end of the lecture. I'm not going to go way into detail on these, but it's important to have something to go on. And we'll talk about jouissance or death drive on the right and death drive jouissance on the left, because I think they operate differently on either side, and that's part of the friction between them. But yeah, I mean, look, I mean, to illustrate, there's that great example. It's a footnote in Nietzsche's On the Genealogy of Morals. But remember where Nietzsche quotes the church father Tertullian, and he quotes Tertullian, and then he quotes St. Thomas Aquinas, because both of them, if I remember correctly, they both discuss the same scenario, right? Which is the idea is that once, like, Jesus comes back and Satan is defeated and everything, you know, the sinners go to hell, the saints go to heaven, and yet the people in heaven are going to watch the people in hell suffer. And it's a weird thing, right? Because Tertullian and Aquinas, they're sitting there, they're going, how can we enjoy ourselves by seeing this horrible pain that other people are in? And the theological twist is like, well, you're going to enjoy yourself by seeing God's justice realized. But I mean, when you look at this in this libidinal way, no, you just are enjoying the other people who either called you stupid or enjoyed all the sexual passions that you as a Christian had to sacrifice, right? You're seeing all of them suffer, and you enjoy it, right? It's really a kind of libidinal fantasy of seeing the people who mocked you or made fun of you suffer. And so even though there's some part of you that's going to have suffering due to seeing them suffer, there's this other part of you that's just going to enjoy seeing them suffer. So it's like, yeah, I'm going to suffer in having to see them suffer, but there's another part of me that's just going to have immense enjoyment in seeing them suffer in hell. So I think that's a good example of showing how this kind of logic plays itself out. And
just an example for like how like an ignorance of these kinds of factors can lead to a sort of utopian approach to politics that kind of just, it's going to be useless because it'll miss important factors about how people actually work. It's like, I used to kind of just be like, oh, you know, football and all the other sports are just, you know, an expression of like toxic competition dynamics and like being like militarized, and it's all a bunch of pomp ceremony, like circus, where, you know, people can get behind like arbitrary fake identities and like put all this energy into something that's not even real, and it's a huge fucking waste of money and spectacle, and people, if they'd just direct that towards something that fucking mattered, that'd be great. And it's like, maybe, but also in every civilization that's been able to function at all, not in a complete state of chaos at every fucking moment, they found some way of giving the mob like a center of attraction that was meaningless, but that they could still pump all that energy into, because it's a way of like directing that in a way that's not going to, like, because if all those people directed their energy towards politics, you don't know that they would actually become like enlightened like Democrat, they care about democracy all of a sudden. No, they would take all of that fucking hype that they're putting towards the red versus blue on the field, and they would just all be putting that into their, the king or whatever it is,
So in McGowan's lecture on Death Drive, McGowan's a big sports junkie. His example is exactly the one you bring up.
Oh, really?
His example is the reason why. Think about, a sport like football, especially, right? What sacrifice is essential to it? These guys just constantly sacrifice their body. We know, especially like the head trauma, the brain trauma that they're going through. They destroy their bodies. It's almost the same. You can even think about pro wrestling, right? What pro wrestlers put themselves through. It's insane. They might have the most, besides football players, the most broken bodies of anybody. And yet, whether you're talking about NFL fans or you're talking about wrestling fans, they put immense effort in knowing the history, knowing all about it. Like the commitment on the fans and the commitment on the football players and the wrestlers, there's immense enjoyment precisely because it involves so much sacrifice and loss. So much time and energy is sacrificed on meaningless activities. I'm not taking away if people like them. I'm not trying to be dismissive, but I mean, they're meaningless in the sense of they're not essential like politics or the economy or things like that. Like the things that really enable us to maintain our material existence. They're just dumb activities, right? I mean, I'm guilty. Like I'm a retro gamer. I have as many dumb activities I'm hooked on as anybody. So it's not dismissing theirs. But the point is, for McGowan, it's precisely because it involves so much sacrifice and so much loss that it is enjoyable. And it all circles around something dumb and meaningless. Like all of the activities we find the most enjoyable really are kind of stupid.
Like diamonds?
Say what?
Like diamonds, right? Because we both watched that episode.
We both have recently watched the there's a show on Netflix called Explained, and I just have to say Netflix is doing some good documentaries right now.
Yes.
But there's on Explained, they do have a little documentary on diamonds and how the diamond industry came into being and how the whole thing of like getting married involves a diamond ring and all that shit. Like they basically do the genealogy of it.
Just like the value of a diamond was set arbitrarily by them, like because it was monopolized in the first place, and then when the monopoly was broken up, they all just kept going by that anyway because they just knew that they could keep it at that level and make more money on the one hand, but also that people wouldn't want the diamonds as much if they weren't. If the sign value, if that rock on the ring did not say someone spent two months of their salary for this, if it didn't say that, then it wouldn't be worth anything. So
and think about it, the more you sacrifice, it's a dumb little object. Okay, it sparkles, and yet it means so much to people precisely because so much sacrifice. I mean, and the more money you blow on it, the more money you waste on it, the more it means to somebody, right? This is why waste is, Bataille is huge on this, and so is Marcel Mauss and Baudrillard, that it's stupid to us that waste means so much, but it does. And that's, in this case, they just happen to channel waste into this highly profitable capitalistic industry. But the idea of social bonds being formed through waste or sacrifice, that goes way back to potlatch societies that Marcel Mauss was talking about. And so it's as if De Boer and the diamond industry just utilize it for its own sake. But there's a deep aspect in our libidinal economy of enjoying loss, enjoying the sacrifice, right? The only reason people enjoy the diamond ring is because so much money was sacrificed on it.
Exactly.
And so again, they showed how we can make essentially they're real diamonds. They're just not made by the earth. They make them in a machine, and yet because they're cheap, nobody, even though they're basically the same material object, nobody wants them. And so
this is supposed to tie back around to jouissance. Is that what we're doing with this, or
right? Because it ties back to death drive. That death drive enjoys not, or is sacrificing the object, losing the object, missing the object, getting, like, it enjoys the very act of you not getting what you want, right? Most people would say, I just want the money that I spent on the diamond, because you can do so much practically with the money. Like, the money can be used for all kinds of rational reasons, self-interest, right? But then when you spend it on the diamond, it's like there's really nothing in your self-interest. It doesn't make any sense, but there's immense enjoyment that people get from doing these kind of things, and it has to do with death drive. So.
We interrupt this conversation for a quick message from our sponsors.
You may recognize this conversation from the past because it is actually a piece of a longer live stream. So what I've done is I've edited the conversations I had with Mikey down into smaller chunks, and I will be releasing those serially until the launch of the Slavoj Žižek's For They Know Not What They Do course, taught by Michael Downs and myself. I will be asking him the questions and hystericizing him, along with a cohort of people who will be joining us live and in the forums as we do a close reading of what Slavoj Žižek claims is his most important theoretical work, more important than Sublime Objective Ideology by far. He said that if you don't have anything to say about For They Know Not What They Do, then keep silent when it comes to Sublime Objective Ideology. But we don't just do close, thorough, hardcore readings. We also have some more introductory stuff. And so if you go to theory-underground.com/events, then you'll be able to see the dates of all of the upcoming events. You see that the Idea of University, taught by myself, Brian, and a couple of educators who are very close to me. And we wanted to focus on Karl Jasper's short work, The Idea of University, as a way to start the year, but it's also a way for Theory Underground to get off on the right track. January 25th is the Professional Managerial Class Consciousness course that I'm co-teaching with Elton LK of the Working Class Intelligentsia podcast. And then in February, on the 25th of February, launches Žižek's For They Know Not What They Do. Mikey has spent 2 decades getting himself to the point where he feels confident enough to teach this book. And I think that humility and effort that he's put in is something that we can all learn from. I mean, come on. He's like our own homegrown Žižek. He's like our own national treasure. I think that we really ought to uplift him and give credit where it's due, not just take him for granted and act like, we don't need to. So that's a part of the reason actually why I really appreciate Brian Becker from Singularity Sublimity podcast. He's done a lot of amazing teaching work himself. A lot of people read the blog and then don't give credit where it's due. And that would be fine if he had a cushy academic career with tenure and all that. But he doesn't. He's working in a warehouse, supporting his mom. We need to hashtag free Mikey from wage labor so that he can spend more time doing what his passion is, which is teaching philosophy and theory, writing books. That's what we want. More of these kinds of conversations. Make it possible. Make a donation. 5, 15, 20, 50, 100. Make the donation today. Please. It means a lot. Words are cheap. Money, now that's where it matters. Get your skin in the game. Show Mikey you care. I hope that we'll get to do a lot more of this in the near future. And then the last thing, I'm doing a countrywide tour this year. I will be on the East Coast, I will be on the West Coast, and I will be everywhere in between. So if you want me to come to your town or city, email me. It's down below. If you want to volunteer, be a part of the street team, host or guide while we're there, let me know. I hope to be in a city